Picture this. You're driving down a back road, maybe heading to the cabin or visiting the grandkids when your truck breaks down. Not just a flat tire or dead battery, something that leaves you stranded miles from the nearest cell tower. Your phone's got no signal. Your GPS is useless. The sun's getting low, and you've got maybe 2 hours of daylight left. Most folks would panic, start walking, and hope for the best. But what if you could look at that situation and think, all right, this is inconvenient, but I've got everything I need right here? What if you could glance at the rocks by the roadside, the dead branches in the ditch, maybe some discarded beer bottles, and see not garbage, but a complete toolkit waiting to be assembled? That's not fantasy. That's exactly what happened to a man I'm going to tell you about, a survival expert who learned something our grandfathers knew, but we've somehow forgotten. He learned that with nothing but what the earth provides and the knowledge in your head, you can craft every tool you need to not just survive, but thrive. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Primitive tools? Come on. I've got a Leatherman, a good knife, maybe a compact survival kit in the truck. And you're right to think that way. Modern tools are marvels of engineering. But here's the thing that'll keep you up at night. Every single piece of gear you own can break, run out of power, or get lost when you need it most. Your grandfather might have carried a pocket knife and known how to use it 6 different ways. Your great-grandfather could probably sharpen that knife on any stone he found. But go back far enough, and you'll find men who could make that knife from scratch, starting with nothing but a chunk of rock and the patience to learn what their hands could do. This isn't about going backward, it's about going deeper. It's about understanding that the most reliable technology isn't the newest, it's the oldest. Fire-making techniques that work the same way today as they did 10,000 years ago. Blade-shaping methods that produce edges sharper than most factory knives. Tool crafting skills that turn any landscape into a hardware store. The man whose story I'm about to share with you learned these skills the hard way, not from books or YouTube videos, but from necessity, failure, and the kind of patient practice that builds real competence. He went from being completely dependent on modern gear to being able to walk into the woods with nothing but the clothes on his back and emerge a week later with a complete workshop of handmade tools. But this isn't just a story about surviving in the wilderness. It's about something bigger, the confidence that comes from knowing your hands can solve problems your brain can identify. In a world where we've outsourced so much of our practical knowledge to machines and devices, there's something profound about reconnecting with the fundamental skills that kept our species alive for millennia. Think about it this way. Every innovation in human history started with someone looking at a problem and figuring out how to solve it with available materials. The first wheel, the first lever, the first blade. These weren't accidents. They were the result of careful observation, patient experimentation, and the willingness to fail until you succeed. Our expert understood this in a way most people never will. He realized that primitive technology isn't primitive at all. It's foundational. It's the bedrock that everything else is built on. When you understand how to make fire without matches, how to create cutting tools without metal, how to fashion containers without plastic, you're not just learning survival skills. You're connecting with the core problem-solving abilities that define human ingenuity. And here's what might surprise you. These skills don't just work in survival situations. They change how you think about problems in general. When you've learned to see potential tools in raw materials, when you've developed the patience to work with what you have instead of wishing for what you don't, when you've built confidence in your ability to create solutions from scratch, those mental habits carry over into every area of life. The journey you're about to hear started with frustration. Our expert was an experienced outdoorsman, someone who thought he knew what he was doing in the wilderness. He had all the right gear, all the latest equipment. But one day, when his expensive tools failed him at exactly the wrong moment, he realized he'd been carrying a false sense of security. He was equipped, but he wasn't capable. There's a world of difference between those two things. That realization led him down a path that would fundamentally change not just how he approached survival situations, but how he understood the relationship between human intelligence and the natural world. He would learn to read landscapes differently, to see opportunities where others saw obstacles, to find solutions where others found only problems. The 8 parts of this story will take you through that transformation. We'll start with the wake-up call that set everything in motion, the moment he realized his high-tech approach to survival had a fatal flaw. Then we'll follow him through his first fumbling attempts at primitive tool-making, the bloody knuckles and dull failures that taught him respect for techniques that seemed simple but demanded mastery. We'll be there for his first real victory, mastering fire-making without modern tools, not just getting a spark, but understanding fire as the foundation of all other primitive technologies. Fire that enables better tools, which enable better shelter, which enables better food procurement, which enables the kind of sustainable survival that goes beyond just making it through the night. From there, we'll watch him tackle the art of stone knapping, turning chunks of rock into razor-sharp blades through techniques that are part science, part art, and part pure determination. You'll see how his first truly sharp stone knife gave him more than just a cutting tool. It gave him the confidence to believe he could solve problems he'd never faced before. The story builds as his primitive workshop grows. Stone axes that could fell trees, scrapers that could process hides, awls that could punch holes. Each new tool expanding his capabilities and teaching him that our ancestors weren't struggling with inferior technology. They were working with the best technology available, and they'd refined it over thousands of years. We'll follow him beyond stone tools, into the sophisticated world of bone and woodworking. You'll discover how animal bones become needles, fishing hooks, and specialized tools that would cost hundreds of dollars in modern equivalents. How wood can be shaped into containers, weapons, and implements that are not just functional, but elegant. The climax comes with his ultimate test, a week-long survival challenge that would push every skill, every tool, and every bit of knowledge he'd accumulated to its limit. This wasn't a casual camping trip or a weekend adventure. This was a deliberate test of whether primitive tools and ancient techniques could sustain modern survival needs. And in the end, we'll come back to what all of this means for the rest of us. Not everyone needs to become a master of primitive technology, but everyone can benefit from understanding the principles behind these skills, the patience they require, the problem-solving mindset they develop, the confidence they build. Because here's the truth that our expert learned and that we're going to explore together. Primitive tools aren't about going backward to a simpler time. They're about moving forward with a deeper understanding of what human hands and human minds can accomplish when they work together. They're about recognizing that the most advanced technology we possess isn't in our pockets or our workshops. It's in our ability to observe, adapt, and create solutions from whatever materials are available. In a world that's increasingly dependent on complex systems and delicate supply chains, there's profound security in knowing that the fundamental tools of survival can be created by anyone willing to learn. Not just physical security, but mental security. The kind that comes from knowing that no matter what situation you find yourself in, your hands and your mind can work together to find a way forward. The journey starts with a man who thought he knew everything about survival, only to discover he knew almost nothing about the most important part, the ability to create the tools that make survival possible. His story is about transformation, but it's also about rediscovery, learning skills that humans have always possessed, but that modern life has allowed us to forget. So whether you're the type who keeps a well-stocked tool shed, or someone who calls a professional for every repair, whether you're comfortable in the wilderness or prefer to experience nature through a windshield, this story has something to teach you. Because at its core, it's not really about primitive tools at all. It's about the primitive strength that still exists in every one of us. The strength to look at a problem, assess available resources, and build a solution one careful step at a time. That strength doesn't depend on having the right equipment or the perfect conditions. It depends on having the right mindset and the willingness to learn. Our expert discovered this the hard way through failures that taught him humility and successes that taught him capability. His journey from dependence to self-reliance is one that anyone can understand, and anyone can apply to their own challenges, whether they involve survival in the wilderness or just the everyday business of solving problems with whatever tools are at hand. The road ahead will show you exactly how he did it, step by step, mistake by mistake, breakthrough by breakthrough. And by the end, you'll understand not just how primitive tools are made, but why the knowledge of making them might be one of the most valuable skills anyone can possess in an uncertain world. His name was Marcus, though most folks just called him Mac. At 52, he had the kind of resume that impressed people at outdoor gear stores. 20 years as a park ranger, certified wilderness first aid instructor, the guy other experienced hikers came to for advice about backcountry routes. His garage looked like a small REI outlet, high-end backpacks, GPS devices with more computing power than the first space shuttles, water purification systems that could turn mud puddle water into something cleaner than what came from most kitchen taps. Mac thought he had wilderness survival figured out, and for 2 decades, his approach had worked just fine. Good gear, careful planning, redundant systems. He'd never spent a night in the woods he hadn't intended to spend, never gone hungry because his equipment failed, never found himself in a situation his training and tools couldn't handle. That confidence lasted right up until an October morning in the Cascade Mountains, when everything he thought he knew got turned upside down by a simple mechanical failure and an embarrassing gap in his knowledge. The trip was supposed to be routine, a solo 3-day reconnaissance hike to scout winter access routes for the Park Service. Mac had done dozens of similar trips. He'd packed his usual gear, lightweight tent, sleeping bag rated for 20 below, camp stove with backup fuel canisters, GPS with extra batteries, emergency locator beacon, first aid kit that could handle everything short of surgery. The weather forecast called for clear skies and mild temperatures. The trail was well marked. He had permits, filed a trip plan, carried maps both digital and paper. If wilderness preparedness was like getting ready for a road trip, Mac had checked his oil, aired up his tires, and packed enough spare parts to rebuild the engine. What he hadn't planned for was his stove's fuel line developing a hairline crack that left him with no way to cook food or melt snow for water. A tiny O-ring failure, probably caused by temperature changes during the drive up the mountain. The kind of thing that happens to even the best equipment at exactly the wrong moment. Now, for most people, this would just mean cold meals and extra water carried from the last stream crossing. Inconvenient, but not dangerous. Mac knew enough wilderness medicine to understand that hypothermia was a bigger threat than hunger over a 3-day period. He had emergency rations that didn't need cooking. He could ration his water bottles and cut the trip short if necessary. But standing there in a light snow squall at 7,000 feet, watching his expensive stove refuse to light while the temperature dropped toward freezing, Mac realized something that bothered him more than the equipment failure itself. He had no idea how to make fire without that stove. Sure, he carried waterproof matches and a lighter as backup, but the available wood was damp from the morning's frost. The wind kept gusting just hard enough to blow out anything he tried to light. He'd gone through half a book of matches and gotten nothing but soggy char for his efforts. He stood there for 20 minutes, frustrated and increasingly cold, before the scope of his problem really hit him. Here he was, a man who'd taught wilderness survival courses, who'd written articles about backcountry safety, who other people trusted to know what he was doing in situations exactly like this one, and he couldn't make fire. Couldn't make fire easily, couldn't make fire at all. The matches were useless in the wind and damp. The lighter worked, but he couldn't keep anything burning long enough to establish a proper fire. His expensive magnesium fire starter produced impressive sparks that died the moment they hit anything that might actually burn. The gear he'd relied on for 20 years was failing him, and underneath all that high-tech equipment, he was just another guy standing in the woods without the first clue about the most basic survival skill humans had ever developed. That night, huddled in his sleeping bag, eating cold energy bars while the temperature dropped into the 20s, Mac did some uncomfortable thinking. His gear had saved him from serious trouble. The sleeping bag kept him warm, the tent kept him dry. The emergency beacon would have summoned help if things got truly desperate. But what if those things failed too? What if he found himself in a situation where modern equipment wasn't available or wasn't enough? The more he thought about it, the more he realized how completely dependent he'd become on manufactured solutions to natural problems. Fire came from matches, or lighters, or camp stoves. Cutting came from factory knives with steel blades. Shelter came from tents designed by engineers and tested in laboratories. Food came from packages with nutrition labels and expiration dates. All of that was fine when the systems worked. But what about when they didn't? What about situations where replacement parts weren't available, where batteries died and couldn't be recharged, where the supply chain that connected him to his solutions simply wasn't there? It wasn't a comfortable line of thinking for a man who'd built his professional reputation on wilderness competence. Mac had always prided himself on being prepared, on having backup systems for his backup systems. But that night in the mountains, he realized that all his backups were just variations on the same theme, modern tools doing modern things in modern ways. He didn't have alternatives. He had redundancies. The distinction might seem subtle, but it kept him awake most of that cold night. When he got back to town 3 days later, Mac did something he hadn't done in years. He admitted he didn't know something important and went looking for someone to teach him. Not another gear store employee with the latest catalog, not another wilderness instructor with the same certification he had. He wanted to find someone who knew how to solve fundamental problems with fundamental solutions. The search led him to a scruffy used bookstore that specialized in hunting and outdoor books. The owner, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s, listened to Mac's story with the kind of patience that suggested she'd heard similar tales before. "You want to learn primitive skills," she said. It wasn't a question. Fire without matches, tools without steel, shelter without nylon. Mac nodded. "I know a guy," she said. "Name's Bill Kowalski, lives about 40 minutes up valley, retired toolmaker, spent the last 15 years learning everything the old-timers knew about getting by with what nature provides. Fair warning though, he doesn't suffer fools. You show up thinking this is going to be easy, thinking it's just bushcraft for beginners. He'll send you home before you get your boots dirty." She scribbled an address on a piece of paper. "Tell him Sarah sent you, and do yourself a favor. Don't bring any gear, nothing. Bill says modern tools make people lazy. If you want to learn primitive skills, you start primitive." 2 weeks later, Mac found himself standing in the driveway of a modest house surrounded by oak trees and blackberry bushes. Bill Kowalski looked exactly like Central Casting would order for a retired toolmaker. Thick hands, sharp eyes, the kind of weathered face that comes from decades of solving problems with careful thinking and patient work. "You the ranger Sarah told me about?" Bill asked. He was holding a piece of what looked like black glass, turning it over in his fingers with the kind of attention most people reserve for expensive jewelry. "That's right, Mac Patterson. I understand you might be willing to teach me some things about fire," Bill interrupted. "About tools, about not being helpless when your fancy equipment quits working." He held up the black glass. "You know what this is?" Mac shook his head. "Obsidian, volcanic glass, sharper than any steel blade you've ever owned, harder than most. Indigenous peoples in this area used it for knives, arrowheads, scrapers, everything they needed to process food, work hides, make other tools." He handed it to Mac. "Feel that edge?" Mac ran his thumb carefully along the edge and jerked his hand back in surprise. The stone had drawn blood from the lightest possible touch. "That's what sharp actually means," Bill said, with satisfaction. "Your expensive hunting knife feels like a butter knife compared to properly knapped obsidian. And this piece, I made it yesterday from raw stone, using tools and techniques that haven't changed in 10,000 years." He gestured toward a small workshop behind the house. "Problem is, most people think primitive means inferior. They see stone tools and think caveman, think crude, think good enough for people who didn't know any better. That's ignorant thinking. Our ancestors weren't stupid. They developed these techniques over millennia, refined them, perfected them. What we call primitive technology is actually mature technology, proven technology. Mac looked at the obsidian blade, then at the small cut on his thumb. "So you could teach me to make something like this?" Bill laughed, but not unkindly. "I can teach you to try. Whether you learn or not depends on how much frustration you can tolerate and how much ego you're willing to set aside. Because here's what I'm going to tell you right up front. Everything you think you know about tools and fire and solving problems with your hands, most of it's wrong. You're going to have to unlearn 20 years of modern assumptions before you can start learning ancient solutions." He started walking toward the workshop. "You coming? We'll start with fire, since that's what got you into this mess. But first, let me ask you something. How many ways do you think there are to make fire without matches?" Mac thought about it. "Well, there's flint and steel, magnifying glass in sunlight. Maybe rubbing sticks together." Bill stopped walking and turned around. "Kid, there are at least a dozen reliable methods for making fire from natural materials. Some work better in wet weather, some work better in dry, some are good for tinder that burns fast and hot, some are good for coals that burn slow and steady, some work with green wood, some need seasoned wood, some work best with specific types of bark or fungus or grass." He continued toward the workshop. "Fire isn't just fire. It's a technology with dozens of applications and hundreds of variables. You want to learn primitive skills? Start by forgetting everything you think is simple about the problems you're trying to solve." That first afternoon in Bill's workshop, Mac learned more about his own ignorance than he'd learned about anything in years. His attempts at the bow drill method, the rubbing sticks together approach he'd mentioned, produced nothing but sore arms and a small pile of wood dust that wouldn't so much as smoke, let alone catch fire. "Patience," Bill kept saying. "Steady pressure, consistent motion, proper materials. This isn't about strength. It's about understanding friction and heat and airflow. It's about reading the wood and the weather and your own body's limitations." By the end of that first session, Mac's hands were blistered, his back was sore, and he had a new appreciation for just how much skill was hidden behind what looked like simple techniques. He also had something else, the first spark of understanding about what he'd gotten himself into. Bill walked him back to his truck as the sun was setting. "You did better than most on your first try," he said. "Most folks give up after 20 minutes. You stuck with it for 3 hours. That tells me you might actually learn something." Mac climbed into his truck, then rolled down the window. "When can I come back?" "Next weekend if you want. But do me a favor. Spend the week thinking about what you learned today. Not just the technique, but what it felt like to be completely dependent on skills you don't have. Because that's where real learning starts, with understanding exactly how much you don't know." Driving home through the darkening valley, Mac found himself thinking about competence versus confidence, about the difference between having solutions and understanding problems. His expensive gear had given him confidence, but it hadn't given him competence. When the gear failed, the confidence had evaporated with it. But what Bill was offering was different. It was competence built from the ground up, solution by solution, skill by skill. The kind of knowledge that couldn't be lost or broken or left behind because it existed in his hands and his head rather than in his gear bag. The question was whether he had the patience and humility to learn it. Because one thing was already clear, this wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick. But for the first time since that cold night in the Cascades, Mac felt like he was on the right path. Mac's second visit to Bill's workshop started the same way as the first, with failure. 30 minutes of steady work with the bow drill, producing nothing but sweat and frustration. His form was better this time. Bill had made him practice the motions at home with a dowel and a piece of scrap wood. But better form still wasn't producing fire. "You're rushing," Bill observed from his seat on an old milk crate. He was working on something with his hands, some kind of scraping tool made from what looked like deer bone, but his attention was clearly on Mac's struggling efforts. "Fire doesn't care how much you want it. Fire comes when the conditions are right, not before." "The conditions look right to me," Mac said, through gritted teeth. He was getting smoke now, at least. thin wisps that rose from the notch he'd carved in his fireboard. But smoke wasn't fire, and they both knew it. "Tell me what you see," Bill said. Mac paused in his bow drilling and examined his setup. The bow was a curved branch about as thick as his wrist, strung with paracord from his keychain. The drill was a straight piece of cedar, maybe 3/4 of an inch thick, one end carved to a blunt point. The fireboard was a split piece of cedar, with a small depression where the drill bit into it, and a triangular notch cut from the edge to collect the hot wood dust. "Looks right to me," Max said. "Cedar on cedar, like you showed me. Dry wood, sharp notch, good tinder bundle waiting." "Look closer," Bill said, "at the dust." Mac bent down and really looked at the small pile of wood particles that had collected in the notch. Most of it was the light brown color of fresh cedar, but scattered through it were darker specks, almost black. "Some of it's darker," Mac said. "That's the heat," Bill explained. "Those dark particles are getting close to combustion temperature. But look at the rest of it. Most of your dust is still light-colored. You know what that means?" Mac thought about it. "I'm not generating enough consistent heat." "Partly, but more important, you're not keeping the heat concentrated. Every time you pause, every time your rhythm changes, every time you let up on the pressure, those hot particles cool down. You're making progress and then losing it, over and over again." Bill set down his scraping tool and moved over to Mac's setup. "Here's what I want you to understand about fire. It's not about force, it's about consistency. Fire is chemistry, and chemistry happens at specific temperatures under specific conditions. Your job isn't to muscle your way to fire. Your job is to create and maintain the right conditions until the chemistry takes over." He knelt beside the bow drill setup. "Watch my rhythm, not fast, not slow, steady like a machine." He began working the bow with smooth, even strokes. "Count with me. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Every stroke takes exactly 2 seconds. Every stroke applies exactly the same pressure." Mac watched Bill work. There was something almost meditative about the consistency of his motion, the way each stroke looked identical to the last one. Within a minute, smoke was rising steadily from the fireboard. "Now look at the dust," Bill said, without breaking rhythm. The pile in the notch was growing, but more importantly, it was all turning dark. Deep brown, then darker brown, then almost black. The smoke was getting thicker, more substantial. "Temperature is building," Bill continued, his voice calm despite the physical effort. "Each stroke adds a little heat. Consistency means the heat accumulates instead of dissipating. Now we're getting somewhere." After another minute of steady drilling, Bill stopped abruptly and set the bow aside. "Now comes the critical part," he said. "See how the dust is smoking? That's a coal trying to happen, but it's fragile. One wrong move and you lose it." He very carefully lifted the fireboard and tilted it slightly, allowing the smoking dust to collect in the notch. Then, with movements so gentle they were almost ceremonial, he began blowing softly on the pile. The smoke intensified. The dark dust began to glow red at the edges. "There it is," Bill said with quiet satisfaction. "Coal." He picked up a prepared tinder bundle, a bird's nest of fine, dry grasses and shredded bark, and carefully transferred the glowing coal into the center of it. Then, holding the bundle at arm's length, he began blowing on it with long, steady breaths. The smoke got thicker. Suddenly, flame erupted from the tinder bundle. "Fire," Bill said simply, and set the burning bundle into a prepared nest of kindling. Mac watched the flames catch and spread, feeling equal parts admiration and frustration. Bill had made it look effortless, but Mac knew from his own attempts just how much skill was hidden in that smooth rhythm and perfect timing. "Your turn," Bill said. "But this time, I want you to think like a machine. Same motion every time, same pressure, same speed. Don't think about fire. Just think about consistency." Mac positioned himself at the bow drill and began to work. This time, he focused entirely on rhythm, counting Mississippis in his head, trying to match the mechanical regularity he'd seen Bill demonstrate. It was harder than it looked to maintain that consistency when his muscles started to tire, when his mind wandered, when the temptation to speed up or bear down harder crept in. But something was different this time. The smoke came earlier and stayed thicker. The wood dust in the notch was turning dark more quickly. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 minutes, Mac could see the red glow that meant coal. "Stop," Bill said. "Transfer to tinder. Gentle now." Mac's hands were shaking slightly as he lifted the fireboard and coaxed the glowing coal into the prepared grass bundle. He'd gotten this far twice before, only to have the coal die in the transfer. This time, he moved with deliberate care, keeping the coal intact, protecting it from wind, giving it the oxygen it needed without overwhelming it. He held the bundle up and began to blow, soft and steady like Bill had shown him. Smoke poured from the bundle. The coal glowed brighter, and then, with a sudden whoosh that startled him, despite expecting it, the tinder burst into flame. "Fire!" Mac shouted, and immediately felt foolish for his excitement, but Bill was grinning. "That's the feeling," Bill said, as Mac carefully placed the flaming bundle into the kindling nest and watched it catch. That's why people get addicted to primitive skills. It's not just about making fire, it's about understanding that you can make fire, that the knowledge and capability exist in your hands, not in your gear. They sat and watched the fire burn up through the kindling into finger-thick sticks, then proper firewood. Mac felt something he hadn't expected, a profound sense of accomplishment that was completely different from any satisfaction he'd gotten from modern equipment. This fire existed because of knowledge he'd acquired and skills he'd developed. It was his fire in a way that no camp stove fire had ever been. "So what's next?" Mac asked. "Next, you learn why fire is just the beginning," Bill said. "See, most people think primitive fire making is about emergency situations, having a backup when your lighter fails. But that's thinking too small. Fire isn't just light and heat. Fire is technology." He picked up a piece of the cedar they'd been using for the bow drill. "You want to make stone tools? You need fire to heat treat the stone, make it easier to work and stronger when you're done. You want to make wooden tools? Fire lets you harden the points, char them to resist rot, bend them into shapes they wouldn't naturally take." Mac hadn't considered any of this. In his modern approach to wilderness survival, fire was for cooking and warmth, period. But Bill was describing something much more fundamental. "Fire is how you turn raw materials into tools," Bill continued. "It's how you process food, preserve meat, render fat for waterproofing. It's how you make cordage from plant fibers, how you hollow out wooden containers, how you extract pitch for glue. Every other primitive skill depends on fire, which is why we started here." He gestured toward a corner of the workshop, where Mac could see various tools and materials that hadn't been there on his first visit. Everything you see there was made using techniques that require fire at some stage, not just for light to work by, but as an active part of the manufacturing process. Mac was beginning to understand that he'd stumbled into something much larger and more complex than he'd realized. He'd come to Bill looking for backup skills, alternatives to his modern gear. But what Bill was describing was an entire integrated system of technologies, each one supporting and enabling the others. "How long does it take to learn all of this?" Mac asked. Bill laughed. "Depends what you mean by learn. I've been at it 15 years, and I'm still discovering things. But to get competent at the basics, fire, cutting tools, simple containers, basic cordage, probably 2 or 3 years of regular practice. To get good at it, longer. 2 or 3 years. Mac found himself thinking about the modern equivalent. If he wanted to become proficient with a new piece of equipment, he could usually figure it out in an afternoon. If he wanted to master it, maybe a few weeks of regular use. But Bill was talking about skills that took years to develop and a lifetime to perfect. "Is it worth it?" Mac asked. "I mean, realistically, how often am I going to need to make fire without matches?" Bill was quiet for a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "Wrong question," he finally said. "You're thinking about this as insurance against equipment failure. That's not what this is about." He stood up and walked over to the tool display, picking up what looked like a knife with a stone blade and wooden handle. "You know what this is? Stone knife? Obsidian knife. I made the blade, carved the handle, wrapped the joint with sinew I processed from a deer hide. Took me about 6 hours from raw materials to finished tool. He handed it to Mac. Test the edge on that piece of paper. Mac drew the blade across a sheet of paper, and it cut cleanly with almost no pressure. The edge was sharper than most factory knives he'd owned. 6 hours, Bill repeated, from stone and stick to something that outperforms most manufactured knives. And this isn't about emergency backup. This is about understanding what human hands can accomplish when they're guided by knowledge instead of limited by dependence on manufactured solutions. He took the knife back and examined the blade in the firelight. When you can make your own tools, you think differently about problems. You see solutions instead of obstacles. You see potential instead of limitations. You develop confidence that's based on capability instead of equipment. Mac was beginning to understand. This wasn't about replacing modern tools with primitive ones. It was about developing a different relationship with problems and solutions. About building confidence that was independent of supply chains and retail stores and manufacturers' warranties. Plus, Bill added with a grin, there's something deeply satisfying about making fire from scratch, about turning raw stone into sharp blades, about creating useful things with nothing but knowledge and patience. It connects you to something that goes back to the very beginning of human civilization. He gestured toward the fire Mac had made. That fire you just created, you made it the same way humans have made fire for thousands of years. Same technique, same materials, same basic understanding of friction and heat and combustion. When you succeeded at making that coal, you were succeeding at one of the fundamental skills that kept our species alive long enough to develop everything else. Mac looked at the fire burning steadily in front of them, flames dancing over wood that would burn the same way whether it was lit with a bow drill or a blowtorch. But somehow, this fire felt different, more real somehow, more connected to the basic business of human survival and human ingenuity. So what's the next skill? Mac asked. Blades, Bill said. You've got fire. Now you need something sharp. But I'll warn you right now, making stone tools is going to make fire making look easy. Stone doesn't forgive mistakes the way wood does. One wrong strike and you can ruin hours of work. He picked up a chunk of raw obsidian, black and glassy, and completely unpromising looking. This is going to become a knife blade, but first, you're going to break a lot of stone, learning how stone wants to break. You're going to cut your fingers, learning how to control the fractures. You're going to get frustrated and want to quit about 50 times. Mac looked at the raw obsidian, then at the finished knife Bill had shown him. The gap between the two seemed enormous. But here's the thing about primitive skills, Bill continued. Every failure teaches you something about the materials you're working with. Every mistake shows you something about technique. And when you finally succeed, when you hold a sharp blade you made from scratch, you'll understand something about human capability that most people never learn. He tossed the chunk of obsidian to Mac, who caught it carefully. Take that home. Spend the week looking at it, thinking about how you might turn it into a blade. Don't try anything yet. Just think about it. Get familiar with how it feels, how it fractures when you apply pressure. Start developing a relationship with the material. Mac turned the obsidian over in his hands. It was heavier than he'd expected, and when he held it up to the firelight, he could see how the light passed through it in places. There were lines and patterns in the stone that suggested natural fracture planes, places where it might split if struck properly. Next weekend we'll start knapping, Bill said. Fair warning, it's going to test your patience like nothing you've done before. But if you stick with it, if you learn to read stone the way you're learning to read fire, you'll end up with blades sharper than anything you can buy. As Mac drove home that evening, the chunk of obsidian on the seat beside him, he found himself thinking about the difference between quick solutions and deep understanding. His modern gear had given him quick solutions. Turn a valve and get fire. Unfold a blade and get cutting capability. But what Bill was teaching him was deeper than solutions. It was understanding the fundamental principles behind the solutions. And there was something else, something harder to put into words. The fire he'd made that afternoon had felt like more than just a successful technique. It had felt like a connection to something larger, older, more fundamental than any gear catalog had ever offered. The obsidian sat there on his passenger seat, a promise and a challenge. In it, he could see his next victory waiting, but he could also see all the failures that would come first, all the frustrations and setbacks and moments of doubt. The difference was, now he knew those failures were part of the process, not obstacles to it. Each broken stone would teach him something about the next one. Each cut finger would remind him to be more careful. Each moment of frustration would be balanced by deeper understanding of what he was trying to accomplish. He was learning patience, though he didn't fully realize it yet. And patience, as Bill could have told him, was the most primitive skill of all. Mac spent that first week staring at the chunk of obsidian like it might reveal its secrets through simple observation. He carried it in his pocket during the day, turned it over in his hands while watching television at night, even kept it on his nightstand where he could examine it by lamplight before going to sleep. By the time he returned to Bill's workshop the following Saturday, he'd developed a theory about how the stone might want to break. There were natural stress lines visible in the volcanic glass, places where the internal structure seemed to change direction. If he could strike it just right along one of those lines, maybe he could get a clean split that would give him a starting point for shaping. Bill listened to Mac's analysis with the kind of attention he might give to a weather report that would determine whether to plant crops. "Not bad thinking," he said finally. "You're starting to see the stone instead of just looking at it. But theory and practice are two different animals, especially when it comes to napping." He led Mac to a work area behind the shop, a sturdy wooden table surrounded by tarps to catch flying stone chips. On the table were several pieces of obsidian in various stages of completion, from raw chunks to what looked like nearly finished blades. There were also tools Mac hadn't seen before, pieces of deer antler, chunks of hard wood, what appeared to be copper rods. "First lesson," Bill said, picking up a piece of leather about the size of a placemat. "This goes on your lap. Obsidian flakes are sharper than surgical scalpels, and they fly when you work. Without protection, you'll cut yourself to ribbons before you learn anything useful." Mac spread the leather across his thighs and held up his chunk of obsidian. "So, where do I start?" "With humility," Bill said dryly. "And with understanding that stone napping is probably the most unforgiving skill you'll ever try to learn. Wood bends before it breaks. Bone has some give to it. Stone just fractures, and once it's fractured, you can't unfracture it. Every strike is permanent." He picked up a piece of deer antler, maybe 8 inches long and worn smooth from use. "This is your hammer, not metal. Too hard, creates shock waves that travel through the stone unpredictably. Antler has just enough give to deliver force without shattering what you're trying to shape." Bill demonstrated the basic grip, holding the antler like a small hammer, then positioned Mac's obsidian chunk on the edge of the table. "First thing you learn is platform preparation. See this edge here? You need to create a striking platform, a flat surface that will direct the force where you want it to go." He showed Mac how to hold the stone steady with his non-dominant hand, while using the antler to chip away tiny pieces, creating a small flat area along the edge of the obsidian. It looked simple enough. Mac's first attempts were disasters. The antler either bounced off the glass-hard surface without doing anything, or struck with enough force to send unpredictable cracks shooting through the stone. Within 10 minutes, he'd turned his promising chunk of obsidian into several smaller, less promising pieces. "Normal," Bill said calmly. "You're learning how much force is too much, how little force is too little, and how the angle of strike affects the direction of fracture. Every piece you break teaches you something about the next one." He handed Mac another chunk of obsidian. "Try again. Lighter strikes this time. Think about coaxing the stone to break where you want it to, not forcing it." The second attempt went better, but not by much. Mac managed to create a small platform without shattering the entire piece. But when he tried to strike a flake from the edge, the stone broke in completely the wrong direction, leaving him with an L-shaped piece that seemed useless for anything. "Better," Bill observed. "You're starting to control the platform strikes, but you're still thinking like someone who's used to materials that do what you want them to do. Stone doesn't work that way." Stone has its own internal logic, its own preferences about how it wants to break. Your job is to learn that logic and work with it, not against it. By the end of that first napping session, Mac had gone through 5 pieces of obsidian and had nothing to show for it but sore hands, a collection of irregular stone fragments, and a growing respect for just how difficult this particular skill was going to be. Frustrating, isn't it? Bill said, as they cleaned up the stone chips. Most people expect to make something useful in their first session. Some kind of blade, maybe not perfect, but functional, doesn't work that way. Stone napping is like learning to play piano. You don't start with Mozart. Mac looked at the pile of broken obsidian. So what do I start with? Understanding the material, learning to read fracture patterns, developing the hand-eye coordination to strike where you intend to strike, with the force you intend to use. Bill picked up one of Mac's failures and turned it over in his hands. Look at this break. See how it spiraled off in that direction? That happened because the internal stress in the stone was different from what you expected. Next time you see a similar stress pattern, you'll remember this and adjust your technique. He handed Mac a small notebook. Start keeping track of your failures, not to criticize yourself, but to learn from them, what you were trying to do, what actually happened, what you think caused the difference. After a few dozen entries, you'll start seeing patterns. Mac spent the next several weeks developing a frustrating intimacy with obsidian fracture mechanics. He learned that humidity affected how the stone responded to strikes. He learned that tiny inclusions invisible to the naked eye could redirect fractures in completely unexpected ways. He learned that what looked like identical pieces of stone could behave completely differently under seemingly identical conditions. Most of all, he learned patience, not by choice, but by necessity. Impatience led to hasty strikes, which led to ruined stone, which led to starting over, again and again and again. The breakthrough came on his 6th visit to Bill's workshop, almost 2 months after he'd started trying to learn napping. Mac had been working on the same piece of obsidian for over an hour, carefully preparing platforms, making tiny adjustment strikes, trying to set up conditions for removing a long, thin flake that might actually be useful as a cutting edge. He positioned the stone, lined up his strike, and brought the antler down with what felt like exactly the right amount of force applied at exactly the right angle. The flake that came off was perfect, 3 inches long, curved slightly, with an edge so sharp it seemed to cut light itself. Mac held it up to the window, hardly believing he'd actually produced something that looked like it belonged in Bill's collection of finished tools. "Well, look at that," Bill said, with unmistakable satisfaction. "You just made your first real blade." Mac turned the flake over in his hands, examining the clean lines of the fracture, the way the edge caught and held light. It wasn't much to look at, just a curved piece of black glass, but it represented something significant, proof that human hands, guided by knowledge and shaped by practice, could transform raw materials into sophisticated tools. "Test it," Bill said, handing him a piece of paper. The obsidian flake sliced through the paper with almost no resistance, leaving an edge so clean it looked like it had been cut with a laser. "Sharp," Mac said unnecessarily. "Sharper than sharp. That edge is probably around 30 angstroms wide, about 3 atoms thick at the cutting surface. Compare that to your best steel knife, which is probably around 400 angstroms. This piece of stone you just made is more than 10 times sharper than manufactured steel." Bill took the flake and examined it carefully. "And you did this with techniques that haven't changed since the Stone Age. Same principles, same materials, same understanding of how controlled fracture can create useful tools." But Bill wasn't done with Mac's education. "Now, for the hard part," he said. Mac looked at him in surprise. "This wasn't the hard part?" "Making one good flake is beginner's luck," Bill explained. "Making them consistently when you need them under less than ideal conditions, that's skill. And beyond that is the real challenge, turning flakes into hafted tools that can handle serious work." He picked up what looked like a knife from his collection, a beautifully crafted tool with an obsidian blade set into a wooden handle and wrapped with what looked like plant fiber cordage. This is what a finished primitive knife looks like. The blade is the easy part, believe it or not. The handle is where most people fail. Mac examined the knife. The blade was held securely in a split wooden handle, with the joint wrapped tightly in some kind of fiber binding. It felt solid and comfortable in his hand, balanced like a quality manufactured tool. "Why is the handle harder than the blade?" Mac asked. "Because the blade just has to be sharp," Bill explained. "The handle has to transfer force, absorb shock, provide grip, and hold everything together under stress. It has to be made from materials that are strong but not brittle, flexible but not loose. And it has to be assembled with techniques that will keep it together even when you're using the knife for hard work." He showed Mac how the handle was constructed, the wooden grip carved with a channel to accept the blade tang, the joint reinforced with pine pitch mixed with charcoal dust, the whole assembly wrapped with sinew that had been softened and stretched, then allowed to shrink as it dried. "Each step has to be done right, or the tool fails when you need it most," Bill continued. "And each step requires different skills, different materials, different techniques. You're not just learning to knap stone, you're learning woodworking, cordage making, adhesive preparation, tool assembly." Mac was beginning to understand that what he'd thought of as making stone tools was actually a complex set of interrelated technologies, each one requiring its own knowledge base and skill set. Making the blade was just the beginning. "How long before I can make something like this?" Mac asked, hefting the finished knife. "Depends how much you practice and how much you're willing to fail," Bill said. "The knapping you can probably get competent at in 6 months or so if you work at it regularly. But a knife like this, understanding wood grain, preparing cordage, mixing adhesives, doing assembly work that will hold up under real use, that's easily a year of learning, probably more. A year." Mac found himself thinking about modern alternatives. He could drive to any sporting goods store and walk out with a knife that would outperform this one in 10 minutes. But that wasn't the point anymore, was it? "What's the point?" he asked Bill directly. "I mean, honestly, why spend a year learning to make something I can buy for $50? Bill was quiet for a long moment. "Same reason you spent 2 months learning to make fire, I suppose. Because knowing how to make something is different from knowing how to buy something. Because understanding solutions from the ground up changes how you think about problems." He picked up Mac's obsidian flake and held it up to the light. "But there's more to it than that. When you can make your own tools, really make them from raw materials, you start seeing the world differently. You look at landscapes and see resources instead of scenery. You look at problems and see opportunities to apply skills instead of reasons to buy equipment." Mac nodded slowly. He was already experiencing some of this shift in perspective. Walking through the woods, he'd started noticing things he'd never paid attention to before. The straightness of certain branches, the dryness of particular types of bark, the way some rocks split naturally along useful lines. "Plus," Bill added with a grin, "there's something deeply satisfying about using tools you made yourself. Hard to explain until you experience it, but there's a connection between maker and tool that you just don't get with manufactured equipment." He handed Mac the obsidian flake. "Take this home, practice using it carefully, cut paper, slice vegetables, see how it handles different materials. But more importantly, start thinking about what kind of handle it needs, what you'd use it for, how you'd hold it, what forces it would need to withstand." Mac wrapped the sharp flake carefully in leather and slipped it into his pocket. Walking to his truck, he found himself already planning the handle design, thinking about wood selection and binding techniques and all the skills he'd need to develop. The obsidian flake was just a piece of knapped stone, but it represented something larger, proof that ancient knowledge could be learned by modern minds, that primitive skills could be mastered by patient practice. It was the first real tool he'd ever made from scratch, and holding it gave him a confidence he'd never gotten from any piece of store-bought equipment. But Bill was right about one thing: making one good flake was just the beginning. The real test would come when he tried to turn it into a tool that could handle serious work day after day without failing when he needed it most. That test was still ahead of him. along with all the frustrations and small victories that would come with learning to work wood and fiber and natural adhesives. But for now, driving home with a razor-sharp piece of stone in his pocket, Mac felt like he was finally starting to understand what Bill had been trying to teach him about the difference between having tools and being able to make them. The difference, he was learning, wasn't just practical, it was fundamental, and it was changing not just how he thought about tools, but how he thought about his own capabilities. 3 months after Mac made his first usable obsidian flake, he had his first complete knife. It wasn't pretty, the handle was clunky, the binding was uneven, and the balance was off, but it worked. More than worked, actually. The blade was sharp enough to shave with, and the handle was solid enough that he could use it for everything from food preparation to carving kindling. That ugly, functional knife changed everything for Mac, not because it was better than his modern knives. It wasn't. But because he'd made it entirely from materials he'd found or processed himself. The blade from obsidian he'd knapped, the handle from a piece of oak he'd carved, the binding from plant fibers he'd prepared, the adhesive from pine pitch he'd collected and mixed with charcoal. Feels different, doesn't it? Bill observed, as Mac used his homemade knife to slice through a piece of leather during one of their workshop sessions. Using something you made versus something you bought. Mac nodded. It did feel different, though he was still trying to understand why. The knife performed its functions the same way any knife would, but there was an intimacy to using it that he'd never experienced with manufactured tools. He knew every part of it because he'd created every part of it. He understood its strengths and weaknesses, not from reading specifications, but from the decisions he'd made during construction. "What's next?" Mac asked. Bill smiled. "Time to think bigger. So far, you've learned fire and blades. But what if you need to cut down a tree? What if you need to split wood, or scrape a hide, or dig a pit? You can't do everything with a knife." He led Mac to a corner of the workshop Mac hadn't paid much attention to before, where larger tools were displayed on wooden pegs. There was what looked like a stone axe with a wooden handle, several scrapers of different sizes, digging tools, and other implements Mac couldn't immediately identify. "This is where primitive technology gets really interesting," Bill explained, lifting the stone axe. "When you understand the principles behind tool making, controlled fracture, force multiplication, material properties, you can create specialized tools for almost any task." He handed Mac the axe. It was heavier than Mac expected, but well balanced. The stone head was beautifully shaped, with a sharp edge that looked like it could bite deep into wood. The handle was smooth and comfortable, wrapped with cordage where it joined the stone. "How long did this take to make?" Mac asked. "The head? About 8 hours to get the basic shape, another 4 to refine the edge and prepare it for hafting. The handle maybe 2 hours to carve and fit. Assembly and binding, another hour. Call it a full day's work for someone who knows what they're doing." Mac swung the axe experimentally, feeling how the weight was distributed, how the balance point fell naturally in his hands. It felt like a serious tool, something that could handle real work. "Want to try it?" Bill asked. They walked outside to where Bill had a section of deadfall timber set up as a chopping block. He showed Mac the proper stance, how to let the weight of the stone head do most of the work, how to aim for spots where the wood grain would split naturally. Mac's first swing was tentative, more of a tap than a chop. The axe bit into the wood about a 1/4 inch deep. "Harder," Bill encouraged. "Trust the tool. Stone is harder than steel when it's properly knapped. That edge will cut deeper than you expect." Mac's second swing was more confident. The axe bit deep into the wood with a solid thunk that sent chips flying. He could feel the impact travel up the handle into his hands, but the tool held together solidly. "Now you're getting it," Bill said. "Third swing, same spot. You're trying to create a notch, not just make random cuts." By his fifth swing, Mac had chopped halfway through a piece of wood as thick as his forearm. The stone axe was removing wood chips as large as anything his modern camp axe had ever produced, and the edge was still razor sharp. "This is incredible," Mac said, pausing to examine the cuts. "I had no idea stone could work this well." "Most people don't," Bill replied. They think primitive means inferior because they've never seen properly made primitive tools. But think about it, our ancestors weren't stupid. They used stone tools for thousands of years because stone tools worked. They refined the techniques, perfected the designs, figured out how to make them efficient and durable. He picked up a wood chip that had fallen from Mac's chopping. This chip was removed by a stone axe made using techniques that are at least 10,000 years old. Same principles, same understanding of physics and material properties. The only difference is the person swinging it. Mac continued chopping until he'd cut all the way through the piece of wood. The cut was clean, the tool had performed flawlessly, and his confidence in primitive technology took another significant step forward. "So how do I learn to make one of these?" Mac asked, hefting the stone axe. "Same way you learn to make knives," Bill said. "Slowly, with lots of mistakes. But axe heads are different from knife blades. Bigger, thicker, they need to be shaped differently. The hafting is more complex too. An axe puts different stresses on the joint between stone and wood." Over the following weeks, Bill introduced Mac to the specialized techniques required for making larger tools. Axe head shaping required different knapping strategies than blade making. Instead of trying to create long, thin flakes, Mac had to learn how to remove smaller, more controlled pieces to gradually shape a thick chunk of stone into a wedge-shaped cutting head. The process was even more unforgiving than knife making. A mistake that might ruin a knife blade could destroy hours of work on an axe head. Mac went through dozens of stone blanks, learning to control the larger, more powerful strikes required for heavy tool making. But when he finally succeeded in creating his first axe head, a rough but functional wedge of obsidian with a sharp edge and a thick back for strength, the sense of accomplishment was proportionally greater than anything he'd felt making smaller tools. Hafting the axe presented its own challenges. The handle had to be strong enough to withstand the shock of chopping, but flexible enough to absorb some of the impact. The joint between stone and wood had to be absolutely secure because a loose axe head was deadly dangerous. Bill taught Mac to select wood carefully, looking for straight grain that would resist splitting under stress. He showed him how to carve the handle to exactly match the eye of the stone head, how to prepare multiple types of lashing to hold the joint together, how to apply pine pitch adhesive in layers that would cure into a bond stronger than the wood itself. Mac's first complete stone axe was crude compared to Bill's examples, but it worked, more than worked. It was a genuine wood-cutting tool that could fell small trees, split firewood, and handle construction tasks that would be impossible with just a knife. "Now you're starting to see the bigger picture," Bill said, as Mac used his homemade axe to split kindling behind the workshop. "Each tool opens up new possibilities. With fire and a knife, you can make cordage and simple wooden implements. Add an axe, and you can build shelter, process large amounts of firewood, harvest timber for bigger construction projects." But Bill wasn't finished with Mac's education. "What about working with hides?" he asked. "Processing plant fibers? Digging roots? Every specialized task needs specialized tools, and every specialized tool requires specialized knowledge to make and use properly." He showed Mac examples of scrapers, tools designed specifically for processing animal hides and removing bark from trees. They looked simple at first glance, just shaped pieces of stone with sharp edges. But Bill explained the subtle differences in edge angles and blade shapes that made each scraper perfect for particular tasks. "A hide scraper needs a different edge geometry than a bark scraper," Bill explained. "Different angle, different thickness, different curve. Use the wrong scraper for a job, and you'll either tear what you're working on or dull your tool unnecessarily." Mac spent the next several weekends learning to make and use different types of scrapers. Each one required understanding not just the tool itself, but the materials it was designed to work with. Hide scrapers needed knowledge of leather processing techniques. Bark scrapers required understanding of which trees produced useful fibers and how to harvest them without killing the tree. The learning curve was steep, but Mac was developing something he'd never had before: a comprehensive understanding of how human needs could be met using only natural materials and human ingenuity. Each new tool he mastered expanded his sense of what was possible to accomplish without modern manufacturing. More importantly, he was beginning to understand how primitive technologies interconnected. Fire enabled tool making, tools enabled material processing, processed materials enabled more sophisticated tools. It was a web of capabilities where each skill supported and enhanced all the others. This is how human civilization started, isn't it? Mac asked Bill one afternoon, as they worked on preparing cordage from plant fibers. Someone figured out how to make one tool, which let them make better tools, which let them solve bigger problems. Exactly, Bill confirmed. Technology isn't just gadgets and electronics. Technology is applied knowledge. It's using understanding to solve problems and meet needs. What we call primitive technology isn't really primitive at all. It's the foundation that everything else is built on. Mac looked around Bill's workshop, taking inventory of everything he'd learned to make over the past 6 months. Fire-starting equipment, knives of various sizes and shapes, a functional axe, multiple scrapers, cordage-making tools, wooden containers he'd carved using stone tools, bone implements for specialized tasks. Each item represented dozens of hours of learning and practice. Each one had required understanding not just how to make the tool, but how to find and prepare the raw materials, how to use the tool effectively, how to maintain and repair it when it wore out. But more than that, each tool represented a connection to human knowledge that went back thousands of years. The techniques he was learning weren't his innovations. They were proven solutions refined by countless generations of people who had needed these same capabilities to survive and thrive. I feel like I'm plugging into something bigger than just survival skills, Mac told Bill as they cleaned up the workshop that afternoon. You are, Bill replied. You're connecting with the accumulated wisdom of human problem solving. Every technique you learn, someone before you figured out through experimentation and passed down through teaching. You're part of an unbroken chain of knowledge that goes back to the very beginning of human tool use. As Mac loaded his growing collection of handmade tools into his truck for the drive home, he reflected on how much his understanding of capability had changed over the past months. When he'd started, he'd thought of primitive skills as backup knowledge, things to know in case his modern equipment failed. But now, he understood that the relationship was actually the opposite. Modern equipment was the backup. It was convenient and efficient, but it was also dependent on supply chains, manufacturing processes, and technologies he didn't understand and couldn't control. The tools he was learning to make, on the other hand, represented pure capability, knowledge that existed in his hands and head, skills that could be applied anywhere natural materials were available. They were technologies he could access regardless of economic conditions, supply chain disruptions, or equipment failures. More than that, they were technologies that made him a different kind of problem solver, someone who looked at challenges and saw opportunities to apply knowledge and skill, rather than someone who looked at problems and started shopping for solutions. The primitive workshop was growing, tool by tool, skill by skill. But more than tools and skills, Mac was developing something that would serve him far beyond any survival situation. The confidence that came from knowing his hands could create whatever his mind could conceive, using nothing more than the materials the natural world provided and the accumulated wisdom of human ingenuity. And that confidence he was learning changed everything about how a man approached not just wilderness challenges, but life itself.